Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name's Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force, Flight Lieutenant Suri Singh. I would now like to invite the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brenda Nelson, to the lectern.
Today marks one of the most significant events in history. Today we pause to mark the 75th anniversary of Imperial Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and the opening of the war in the Pacific. Japan's attack on the United States was a defining moment of the Second World War and a turning point in the 20th century. Already fighting a bloody war in China, Japan's militaristic and expansionist government launched a preemptive strike against the then neutral United States of America, while the European powers were embroiled in war in Europe and Africa. The Japanese hoped a disabling blow against the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet would allow Japanese forces to move against British, Dutch and American territory in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Early on Sunday, the 7th of December 1941, more than 350 Japanese fighters, torpedo bombers and bombers were launched from 6 Japanese aircraft carriers and attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Assaulting in 2 waves, the Japanese achieved complete surprise. The operation lasted roughly 90 minutes. Amid the black billowing smoke and raging fires, the Japanese sank 4 American battleships, damaged 4 more, and destroyed hundreds of American aircraft. Almost 2,300 Americans died. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft. The British, along with a small number of Australian airmen, had already gone into action against the Japanese in northern Malaya, where Japanese forces had invaded just hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese continued to launch coordinated attacks against Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Guam and Wake Island. These events would herald the defence of Australia's vital interests. President Franklin D. Roosevelt described the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor as, and I quote, "a day that will live in infamy." Shortly afterwards, the United States joined the British Commonwealth and Soviet Union in an alliance against Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, escalating the Second World War into a truly global conflict. The immense Pacific Ocean became a vast battlefront. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the Japanese rapidly occupied much of Southeast Asia and large areas of the Pacific. Regions of Australia's mandated territory, New Guinea, were invaded, and the Australian mainland came under attack from Japanese aircraft and submarines. So grave was the threat that Prime Minister John Curtin described the first months of 1942 as Australia's darkest hour.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. We warmly welcome Mr. Cliff McWhirter, a former member of Z-Force, who's come all the way from Western Australia to join us for this evening's ceremony. Also this evening, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony around Australia. Also, during this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem? If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we pay tribute to Sergeant Garrett Sidney White, who was killed on active service during the Second World War. Born in Gawler, South Australia, on the 2nd of April 1920, Garrett White, known as Gary, was son of Cornelius White and Myrtle White, and the youngest brother to Doris and Ellen White. The Second World War broke out in 1939, and White enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force, on the 17th of August 1940, aged 20. His brother Alan also enlisted in the RAAF. Gary commenced training as a wireless operator and air gunner, while Alan trained as a pilot and went on to serve in the Mediterranean theater and in Europe. He survived the war. Following training, Gary White embarked in May 1941 for overseas service, where he joined No. 1 Squadron RAAF at Sembawang in Singapore. In August, the squadron moved to Kota Bharu in northeast Malaya. There, White joined the crew of Lockheed Hudson, a twin-engined light bomber. From its base at Kota Bharu, No. 1 Squadron carried out coastal reconnaissance and patrols. No. 1 Squadron was the first squadron to see action in the Pacific War. Before the Japanese raids on Pearl Harbor, which happened on the 7th of December on the other side of the international date line, Japanese convoys were sighted moving south of Indochina. Early on the 8th of December 1941, 7 Hudsons of No. 1 Squadron were dispatched after reports that a convoy of Japanese ships was shelling beach defenses and preparing to land troops in Malaya. By dawn, 1 transport had been destroyed, a second was ablaze, and a third later disappeared after receiving many direct hits. No. 1 Squadron lost 2 aircraft and 2 air crews. White was the wireless operator, air gunner on one of the lost Hudsons. His aircraft was shot down and crashed into the sea off Kota Bharu. Only one of White's fellow crewmates, Donald Dowie, survived the crash. Dowie became the first Australian to be captured as a prisoner of war by the Japanese. White was first reported as missing, presumed killed. It was not until Dowie's return home after his release from captivity at the end of the war that White's fate was confirmed. Back home in Australia, White's mother, Myrtle, refused to believe that her youngest son was dead. She wrote several times to the RAAF, stating her belief that her son had survived due to information conveyed by the spirit of her late husband, Cornelius. She believed that Gary had been rescued by local people or by an American submarine, had been taken to America, and was suffering from amnesia following the crash. Subsequent investigations by the RAF could not support Myrtle's belief. There was no doubt that White was killed in action. He was 21 years old. The 2 engines from the aircraft in which White was a crew member were discovered and recovered from the ocean floor by a local Malaysian fisherman in 1979. These became part of the memorial's collection and are now displayed in the galleries. White's name is commemorated upon the Singapore Memorial at the British and Commonwealth War Cemetery at Kranji, Singapore. Sergeant Garrett Sidney White's name is listed here on the Roll of Honour on my left, among some 40,000 from the Second World War. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Sergeant Garrett Sidney White, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you a very good evening. Thank you.